The landlord of this BB is so sick, she sneaks into her guests' rooms while they're out, sneaking into their rooms, going through the tenants' personal belongings. Not only that, if they were male guests, she would also rinse her mouth with the guest's toothbrush. She looked like she was enjoying herself, but suddenly one day, the old lady's behavior was discovered by a tenant. To ease the embarrassment, he simply killed the man. The old lady's name was Auntie Mui. She was a poor, lonely woman. She didn't even have a child. A few naughty young men in town. They would often block her in and bully her. After the death of the man she'd been with all her life, she was left with nothing, and she owed a large loan to the bank. To pay off the loan, she used her house to open a simple bed and breakfast. It wasn't long before Aunt May's bed and breakfast had its first occupant, but by being overly welcoming, Auntie Mui was disgusted by the male guest, so he left his girlfriend and left the house alone. Nevertheless, Auntie Mui still tried to comfort the girl. The two became good friends. Soon after the girl left the hostel, Auntie Mui refurbished the house and took the initiative. Outside the train station, she solicited tenants. This day she met a young man. Once Bob had taken up residence in the BB, Aunt May began to behave differently. She started to dress up. Sometimes she didn't even look like a 70-year-old aunt. What's more, when preparing breakfast for Bob, she would first taste it with Bob's spoon. After he had finished his drink, Auntie May would always act satisfied. Whenever Bob left the house, he would sneak into his room, putting Bob's deodorant under his own armpits and using it again and again, and then he would grab the perfume from his bag and spray it on. Finally, Auntie May actually picked up Bob's toothbrush. She smelled it first, then she put it in her mouth and brushed her teeth. Suddenly Bob came back from outside. Auntie May was so frightened that she ran to the bed. She made the excuse that she was changing the covers. Bob didn't think much of it. He took his things and left. Knowing that Bob liked to watch football, Aunt May paid for a TV in her room, and when she had nothing better to do, she tried to reach out to Bob.
Come on, ref!
Sickest old lady I've ever met. As a landlady, she asked a male guest to carry her bath towel. What's even worse is that she even fantasizes about going out with a young man. If she was a multimillionaire woman, that would have been a dream come true. But Auntie Mui had nothing, and all she did was, just because Bob had beaten up a punk who was bullying her. Ever since then, Auntie May has thought of herself as Bob's girlfriend, standing in front of him every day like a fine woman. Not only that, she would also share these things with her pen pal Sarah. Soon Sarah arrived. At first sight of Bob, Sarah was amazed. She couldn't believe that such a handsome man liked older women. So that very evening, she tested Bob's physical abilities for Aunt May. Aunt May saw what happened upstairs. The next day, Aunt May blamed Sarah. They had a big fight about it. A depressed Sarah went to her next-door neighbor's house for a break. The old lady tells her about Aunt May's past, but Aunt May upstairs hears all this. After Sarah leaves, Aunt May finds the neighbor. She was upset that her neighbor had spoken ill of her behind her back, so she brutally murdered her neighbor and then deliberately acted sad to seek comfort from Bob, but Bob would never have known. The old woman in front of him had thrown her husband's ashes into the trash. On one occasion, Aunt May came into Bob's room. She came into his room again to do something bad, and Bob saw it. Bob thought the reason Sarah left must be because Aunt May likes to pry into the private lives of her tenants, so he was going to move out of the house too. Aunt May came to the hospital in the afternoon. She pretended to have insomnia. She tricked the hospital into getting a few sleeping pills. When she got home, she apologized to Bob for what had happened. Then she made up a lie that he had a child about Bob's age that had died a few years ago. Bob felt guilty when he heard that. This old lady was trying to keep the tenant for herself, slipped sleeping pills into his drink. After a few drinks, Bob passed out. Aunt May took Bob straight into the living room and did something bad to him. The next day, before Bob woke up, Auntie Mui took care of the scene, but he was clearly feeling some back pain. Bob realized something was wrong, and that's when a letter arrived from the postman. Aunt May wanted to sign for it, but Bob stopped him. She opened the letter and saw that it was from Sarah. In the letter, she explained everything to Bob, so he was ready to leave immediately, but Aunt May continued to keep Bob, only to have Bob refuse. It couldn't be helped. Aunt May had hit the bottom of the barrel. Aunt May had lost all sense of reason, and in a matter of seconds, she was on top of Bob.
Is that too much to ask?
After all this, she found several piles of cash in Bob's suitcase and dug a big hole in the yard. She buried Bob and his luggage in it. Then she wrote to Sarah to tell her she was going on a trip. She wanted her to come and help look after the house. I thought I'd come here to see Bob. Instead, Aunt May told her Bob had left a few days before. He hadn't been here for a while. There was an apple tree in the yard. Maybe Sarah will never know that the baby's father is buried under it. At the end of the story, the old lady took Bob's savings and started a new life for herself, and Sarah is left behind in the bed and breakfast.